and just a bunch of commotion in the hallway. The halls are pretty hollow, so noise echoes throughout.
Hayden Panettiere's final days are now surrounded by troubling questions after a neighbor
And I had just heard about someone collapsing, and then
reportedly described hearing crying and screaming in the building before the
afterwards there was talk about cardiac arrest. I can't confirm any of that. That's just what
actress was found unresponsive, adding another disturbing detail to an already confusing timeline. According to the reference material, the sounds were connected to an apartment complex where Hayden had been staying, and a resident recalled hearing what sounded like a heated argument in the garage, including repeated pleas for someone to stop, while also saying that authorities had been contacted multiple times. But that is only one part of a much larger story, because the circumstances surrounding Hayden's death have raised questions about what happened inside the apartment when the critical events occurred, and why different accounts of those final moments appear to differ. Hayden Panettiere was known to millions as a child star who grew into a successful television and film actress, but behind the public image was a much more complicated personal struggle that she had openly discussed over the years. The reference describes her as someone who had faced substance use problems and difficult periods in her life, while also trying to rebuild herself and maintain a relationship with her daughter. That history makes the latest reports even more difficult to process, because the story is not simply about a famous actress who suddenly passed away. It is about a woman whose life had already been marked by vulnerability, recovery attempts, complicated relationships, financial difficulties, and repeated efforts to move forward. According to the material provided, Hayden was found unresponsive on a Sunday at an apartment in Greenville, South Carolina, and emergency responders were called amid reports of a serious medical emergency. A witness described hearing significant commotion in the hallway, explaining that the building's hollow corridors caused sounds to echo. There was talk of cardiac arrest, but the witness specifically acknowledged that this was information they had heard and could not independently confirm. That distinction matters because so much of the discussion surrounding Hayden's death involves information that remains part of an evolving investigation rather than established fact. One of the most important questions concerns Narcan, the medication commonly used to reverse opioid effects. The reference says Hayden's boyfriend, Brian Hickerson, was reportedly described by his brother Zach as having administered Narcan after Hayden was found in bed. Yet other accounts reportedly placed Hayden somewhere else when she was discovered, creating a discrepancy that investigators would need to resolve through evidence rather than speculation. One account described Hayden as being found in a chair, while another described Brian waking up and discovering her beside him in bed. Those differences may sound small, but in an investigation involving a precise timeline, even a small difference can become significant. The question becomes simple but extremely important. What exactly happened between the last time Hayden was seen well and the moment emergency help was requested? The reference says Brian had reportedly told police that earlier that morning around 10:30 Hayden was doing her makeup and appeared to be going through an ordinary part of her day. The two were apparently expected to meet Zach later, but communication stopped. Brian then reportedly left the apartment to get something, although what he went to get has not been disclosed in the supplied material. He eventually returned, and at some point the two apparently went to sleep. That creates a gap in the timeline, and that gap is where many of the unanswered questions remain. What happened after Brian returned? Did the two speak? Did anything happen before they went to sleep? When did Hayden become unresponsive? And when was Narcan actually administered? The reference does not provide definitive answers to those questions, and it would be irresponsible to turn speculation into fact. What it does provide is a series of details that investigators could potentially compare with physical evidence, surveillance footage, phone records, medical findings, and witness accounts. The reported neighbor testimony adds another layer. The person who said they were coming down an elevator recalled hearing what sounded like a screaming match in the garage, and said Hayden repeatedly pleaded with Brian to stop. The witness also said they personally contacted the sheriff's office several times. If accurately reported, that testimony could become relevant to understanding the environment surrounding Hayden during the period before her death. But it is important to separate an allegation or recollection from a proven finding. The reference itself emphasizes that, at the time described, no one had been charged and no one had been publicly identified as a person of interest in connection with Hayden's death. That means the reported statements should not be treated as proof of what caused her death or who, if anyone, was responsible for it. The boyfriend's history is another part of the story that has drawn attention. The supplied material says Brian had previously pleaded no contest in a domestic violence-related case, and that shortly before Hayden's death, a request connected to those charges was reportedly denied by a judge. The reference says the decision came only days before Hayden died, and that the judge cited concerns about Brian's continued condition. Again, that history is relevant background, but it does not by itself establish what happened in Hayden's final hours. The distinction is crucial because past behavior and present circumstances are not automatically the same thing. Investigators would have to establish the facts surrounding the specific incident independently. Another troubling allegation concerns Hayden's belongings. The reference says Hayden's mother, Leslie Vogel, reportedly told investigators that Brian had pawned some of Hayden's possessions for cash. One of the items mentioned was a vintage guitar, something that could have had personal and sentimental value. The allegation raises questions about Hayden's financial situation and the dynamics of the relationship, particularly because the supplied material describes Hayden as struggling financially despite her fame. People often assume that a recognizable Hollywood name automatically means immense wealth, but the reference portrays Hayden's later life as much more modest, with financial pressure and fewer acting opportunities than people might expect. Her memoir was reportedly written partly because she needed income, adding another dimension to the pressures she was facing. At the same time, Hayden's story was never only about money or fame. Those who knew her described someone who was trying to change her life and reconnect with a sense of purpose. The pastor who met Hayden through ministry reportedly remembered her as kind and open to conversation, particularly when discussing her daughter and her past. He described an emotional sadness surrounding her, while another person familiar with Hayden characterized her as talented, generous, and kind, but repeatedly knocked off course by difficult circumstances. That portrait is important because it reminds us that the public headlines can never fully capture the person behind them. Hayden had spoken openly about her struggles, including addiction and recovery, and the supplied material describes her as someone who had entered treatment voluntarily and continued searching for a way forward. Her daughter was reportedly an important part of that motivation. She wanted a different life, wanted to move forward, and wanted to be there for her child. That makes the reports about her final hours especially heartbreaking. There were reportedly plans for an ordinary day, including meeting up with family, and then communication suddenly stopped. A routine morning appears to have turned into an emergency, leaving behind a chain of questions that investigators now have to reconstruct. The Narcan issue sits at the center of that timeline because the medication is supposed to act quickly when an opioid overdose is occurring, but its effectiveness depends on timing and circumstances. The reference includes a medical expert explaining that Narcan cannot reverse every possible cause of an emergency, and that delayed administration can mean it is no longer effective. The expert also discussed the possibility of determining whether naloxone had been administered through toxicology and other forensic testing. These medical questions could potentially help investigators establish whether Narcan was administered, and more importantly, when it may have been administered relative to Hayden's condition. That is why the distinction between medication being detected in the body and medication being present only in a nasal passage could matter to a forensic investigation. But these are medical and investigative questions, not conclusions about Hayden's case. The final determination would depend on the actual autopsy, toxicology, forensic evidence, and official findings, none of which are fully provided in the reference. Surveillance footage could also become critical. The material says police had reportedly seized cameras around the apartment complex. If that is accurate, those recordings could potentially establish when people entered or left, how long they were gone, and whether a trip to a pharmacy or another location actually occurred. That kind of evidence can be far more reliable than conflicting recollections, because a camera does not have to remember an event after the fact. Phone records and electronic communications could provide another timeline, potentially showing who was contacted when messages were sent, and what happened immediately before and after the emergency. This is why investigators may ultimately be able to answer questions that public discussion cannot. People can give different explanations, misunderstand details, or remember events differently, but physical and digital evidence can sometimes narrow down what was actually possible. And that brings the story back to the neighbor who reportedly heard crying and screaming. If the account is accurately documented, investigators may want to establish exactly when those sounds occurred, where they came from, who was present, and whether the timing overlaps with any other evidence from the apartment complex. A witness hearing an argument does not automatically explain a death, but it can become one piece of a larger timeline. The same is true of the reports about Hayden's belongings, the earlier domestic violence history, the Narcan allegation, the differing descriptions of where Hayden was found, and the reported trip away from the apartment. None of these details should be treated as a final answer on its own. Together, however, they show why so many questions remain. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that Hayden's final hours may have looked ordinary at first. She was reportedly doing her makeup that morning. There were plans to meet family. There was apparently no indication to the outside world that the day would end in tragedy. Then the communication stopped, an emergency unfolded, and a series of conflicting details began to emerge. The public may never know every private moment that occurred inside that apartment, but investigators can potentially reconstruct the timeline through evidence. The neighbor's account, if corroborated, could help establish what was happening around the building. Surveillance footage could establish movement, phone records could establish communication, toxicology could provide medical answers, and forensic testing could help determine whether Narcan was administered and what role it may have played. Those are the kinds of facts that matter more than speculation. Hayden Panettiere's life was already complicated long before this final chapter. She experienced the intense pressure of becoming famous at a young age, struggled publicly with addiction, faced difficult relationships, and tried repeatedly to rebuild her life. Yet people who met her in her later years still described someone who wanted a future, someone who cared deeply about her daughter, and someone who was searching for stability and peace. That is why the reports surrounding her death have resonated so strongly. Behind the celebrity name was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and a person who had spent years trying to overcome problems that had become part of her public identity. The reported crying and screaming heard before her death now adds a haunting question to that story, but it is still only one piece of an investigation that requires evidence. The biggest unanswered question is not simply what the neighbor heard. It is what happened during the hours between Hayden's apparently ordinary morning and the moment she was found unresponsive. Until investigators established that timeline, the conflicting accounts, the Narcan question, the reported surveillance footage, and the allegations involving Hayden's belongings will continue to fuel questions. What happened after Brian reportedly left the apartment? Why did different accounts describe Hayden's location differently? When was Narcan obtained and when was it administered? What will the surveillance cameras show? And what will the official medical findings reveal about the circumstances of Hayden's death? Those answers cannot come from rumors or assumptions. They have to come from evidence. For now, the supplied material makes one thing clear. The final chapter of Hayden Panettiere's life contains a number of unresolved details, and the reported cries and screams heard before her death may become an important part of understanding what happened. Hayden spent years trying to find a way forward, hoping to rebuild her life and remain connected to the people she loved. Her story now leaves behind not only grief, but a demand for clarity. Until the evidence fills in the missing hours, the most responsible conclusion is also the most unsettling one. There are still questions that have not been answered, and the truth about Hayden Panettiere's final moments depends on what investigators can prove rather than what anyone simply believes.